Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Early Muslim Expansion, Arab Conquest of Iran and Egypt, Part 3. So last time we saw the end of the brilliant general Khalid al-Walid. Despite his illustrious career, his end was not so glorious. He basically got sacked by Umar, lived a couple of sad final years, and then died. We've moved on from him, but we do remember his exploits and the talents he brought to the early caliphate. And now we're moving into the next stage. I think we're heading to Egypt, so that will be very exciting. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction.
Having visited Alexandria multiple times earlier in his life, Amr was well aware of just how prosperous the Nile region was, and believed it would be easy to conquer. The new commander put forward his plan to seize Roman Egypt for it.
Yeah, Roman Egypt was a very fertile region, and it was often considered sort of the breadbasket of the empire. Particularly in earlier years, it provided a lot of the grain that fed the rest of the empire, and so of course that came with resources and a lot of wealth. So it was a very prestigious colonial holding.
Islam, confidently declaring to the Caliph, it is the richest of lands and the weakest in defending itself. Although Umar, who wished to consolidate Muslim gains after years of incessant warfare and plague, was initially reluctant, believing Amr was underestimating the task, his eloquence and persistence eventually led the Caliph to relent.
And of course, that's not to mention the historical importance of Egypt. Of course, it was an empire in its own right. I mean, even when it fell under the influence of the Romans, it did still have a lot of influence. So, I mean, there are a lot of reasons that an expanding empire in this area would look to Egypt as, a next region to conquer.
Restricted to just 4,000 troops, mainly cavalry, Amr set forth from Jabia that same night in total secrecy, under the condition that he would withdraw if instructions to turn back reached him before he crossed into Egypt. However, if Amr's army was already inside Egypt when these instructions arrived, it could keep going. Convinced almost immediately that this expedition was too risky, Umar sent a camel rider off to Amr carrying a sealed letter ordering him to pull back. When it reached the general at Rafah, just a few miles from Egypt, Amr understood that the letter would doom his expedition before it even began. So Amr left the message unopened and moved into Egypt, and only then opened the letter.
Yeah, I mean, upon hearing the conditions that Amr was given, if I call this off before you get to Egypt, then you gotta come back. But if you're already in Egypt, then whatever, continue. It's pretty clear what he would do. I mean, with the communication available at the time, he could always claim that I didn't get the letter until this point, or I didn't see it, or it wasn't delivered to me, or whatever. So, of course, he's going to go ahead with his expedition. I mean, it's his idea, after all.
And since the army was already in Egypt when Umar's orders were revealed, Amr reasoned that it could keep going.
I mean, it's a sneaky little bit of reasoning, but, whatever you have to do, I guess.
The timeless province of power and riches was incredibly vulnerable, weakened by years of military laxity, and alienated from the imperial authorities in Constantinople by long-standing cultural and religious differences.
Yeah.
The primary factor was that the Copts, Egypt's native population, adhered to a different form of Christianity to the empire at large. Emperor Heraclius in particular persecuted any perceived heretic in a manner that made religious division inevitable.
Yeah, this was a pretty deep religious difference that had been around for a while. It was probably not going away. I mean, have always been a lot of divisions within Christianity, and Egypt was certainly separated from, say, Constantinople and other regions of the empire by their religious differences, even though, of course, they were all Christian. Well, they weren't all Christian, but largely the empire was Christian.
the Roman authorities in Alexandria were alerted to Amr's presence, responding by raising troops and sending some of them to reinforce Pelusium, the key to Egypt. Setting forth from Arish in late December 639, the Caliphate's small army of veterans soon reached Pelusium, besieging it by land. However, Roman naval superiority meant that the city garrison could be reinforced and supplied, and this led to a 2-month-long siege, which was only brought to a conclusion when the Muslims repulsed a sortie and stormed the city in mid-February 640.
So once again, we do see Roman naval power taking a role here. I mean, I'd say at this point, the Byzantines were probably the most powerful state in the Mediterranean. I don't know if they were the masters of the Mediterranean as they once were, but they still had a lot of power in the region. I mean, they were dealing with some European pirates, but they really didn't have much competition. I mean, they would in the future. They'd face a lot of competition in terms of trade and military dominance of the Mediterranean, but at this point, they still definitely have their area of influence, and they can and have used that to their advantage. But, that only takes them a certain distance. If the Muslim forces are that much more powerful on land and are dominant, then even the Roman strong navy won't be enough to save them and to save their provinces from, conquest.
After taking Pelusium, to the alarm and astonishment of the government in Alexandria, Amr marched unopposed along the Nile Delta's eastern fringe until he reached the citadel of Bilbaes. The defenders resisted under blockade for a month, giving the Romans time to shift their forces around. Aware that the marauding 4,000 Arabs were aiming for the Memphis area, Egypt's prefect and patriarch of Alexandria, Cyrus, marched a 20,000-strong army to reinforce the nearby fortress called Babylon. Commanded by Augustalis Theodorus and garrisoned by 5,000 soldiers, Babylon was one of the Nile's strongest defensive bastions, standing 60 feet high in places and possessing walls up to 6 feet thick. By the time Amr starved the Bilbaeus defenders into surrender in the spring of 640, the Romans were prepared for his inevitable assault. Bypassing Heliopolis on their left, the Muslims arrived outside Babylon in May. Due to its sheer size, only some of Theodorus's army were manning the battlements, while most were encamped outside of the northern wall of the fortress, protected by a deep arcing ditch. Fortifying this secondary position even further were spikes in front, and
Yeah, I'm curious to see what sort of fight the Romans are able to put up, because so far they've been completely decimated by the forces of the Caliphate. And like we mentioned, this is a pretty vulnerable region, so I'd be surprised if they were able to put up substantial resistance to the Muslim forces. Not to mention that, while the local population and local elites, they may not necessarily side with the Muslims, they do have a little bit of tension with the Byzantine court in Constantinople, so they may be a little more willing to make deals with other powers. I don't know, I guess we'll have to see.
Dug sections around the perimeter to act as sally points. Shortly after arriving and witnessing the Roman strength arrayed inside Babylon, Amr launched his 4,000 against the Roman units directly in front of the trench. After a hard-fought skirmish, the Muslims were repulsed with relative ease and set about finally making camp. Observing that his plan to keep Theodorus on the defensive was paying off, Amr mounted daily raids against the Roman positions all along the ditch. Furthermore, in an attempt to conceal just how tiny his forces were, the Muslim commander split and spread it over a large area. This state of affairs lasted for 2 months, the Muslims constantly assailing the Roman positions, and the Romans remaining hunkered down behind the ditch, presumably believing they would be able to win without fighting. By July, no opportunity to gain a decisive victory had shown itself to Amr.
And to be fair, regardless of the troops themselves and which side has superiority, the Romans are familiar with the local territory. They hold these big walled cities. They can probably keep them resupplied using, the waterways. So they do have a lot of advantages that, their strategy would certainly be defensive. They want to hide behind the walls of their cities and stay resupplied for as long as possible. No reason to waste a bunch of lives on skirmishes or head-on-head battles.
And his men were slowly tiring. So, having put the eventuality to the back of his mind, the man who had proclaimed that taking Egypt would be simple wrote to the Caliph asking for reinforcements. Rather than chiding his overly optimistic general, Umar mustered and sent him 4,000 reinforcements to conclude the campaign,
That's
who
pretty
reached
good.
Hama a few weeks later. With these new forces, the Muslim attacks on Babylon were renewed with even greater force, killing large numbers of Roman soldiers, but failing to break the bastion's resistance. Even more hesitantly than the first time, Amr sent another request for Umar's aid.
This has really been a lot more difficult than Amr expected, though to be fair, it does seem like he really misjudged how much of a cakewalk the conquest of Egypt would be. I mean, I still believe that the Muslims can do it, but, you can't just saunter in there with a couple thousand troops and, just wipe your hands clean instantly. It's going to be a bit of a battle, even if the province is vulnerable.
This time, a further 4,000 troops were dispatched under the leadership of Zubayr bin al-Awwam, who, despite being offered Amr's command by the irritated Caliph, merely stated that he wished to help the Muslims engaged in Egypt.
Yeah, I mean, Umar is irritated, but at least he's not being petty, or at least too petty. He's still sending troops to support his men. I suppose he thinks, well, we're in it now. I might as well commit and try to finish what Amr has started.
These new troops arrived in late September. After conducting a personal reconnaissance mission around the area, Zubayr pointed out something to Amr which the general seems to have missed. Still present about 10 miles behind the Muslim army was the Roman garrisoned city of Heliopolis. If coordinated correctly, these troops could smash into the Muslims from behind if Theodorus launched any attack from Babylon. To remove this potential threat, Amr led a large portion of his 12,000 soldiers to Heliopolis, leaving just enough at the fortress to keep the Romans on their toes. Upon approaching the walls, however, some of the garrison's cavalry contingent emerged from the city and beat some of Amr's horsemen in a brief engagement.
The rare Roman cavalry victory. I mean, seems like it was a relatively small skirmish, but still a rare occurrence.
Nevertheless, they were forced to pull back inside the walls as the city was besieged. Only a short time after investing Heliopolis, Zubayr and a small unit of hand-picked warriors scaled the walls in a dashing maneuver and breached the city.
Wow.
Seeing this, and realizing that the result of the clash was inevitable anyway, Heliopolis' garrison sued for peace and paid the jizya, after which
I mean, that was quick, a lot quicker than this siege Amr has been keeping up. They literally just marched on this city, climbed the walls, and charged straight in.
Amr and Zubayr returned to Babylon. In their absence, the Romans had driven away the Muslim detachments closest to the trench and re-established their positions beyond it. Theodorus, likely realizing that he wasn't going to have the luxury of simply waiting the invaders out, began employing the Muslims' own tactics against them, launching daily raids through the Roman bridgeheads. Although the Romans generally lost more men in these scattered engagements, they could afford to, while Amr could not. The stalemate went on relatively unchanged until a revered Arab officer, Kharija bin Huzafa, approached Amr with a risky but potentially decisive plan to win the battle.
Let's hear it.
That night, Kharija was given a cavalry regiment and ordered to lay his trap, which he did by riding around to the southern spur of a featureless ridge on the eastern side of the field. After quietly taking up a concealed position relatively close to the Romans' ditch, the Muslim cavalry waited. As Huzafa suspected, when morning came, the Roman forces crossed the trench in force and deployed for battle. The Muslims arrayed opposite them. When both sides were ready, Theodorus launched his attack across the front, pushing Ammar, who ordered his army to retreat from Babylon with suspicious ease. It was in reality a feigned retreat.
Well, we've got a pretty classic and simple strategy of feigned retreat combined with some cavalry ready to crash down behind the enemy. But you know what? It is a classic strategy because it's effective. You know, it's simple, but it's daring, and it works. And we're seeing it being utilized, very well here.
When the melee had moved far beyond Babylon's defensive trench, Carriger's mounted contingent galloped out from their hiding place behind the ridge and occupied the crossing areas which Theodorus would have to use for any retreat. Ammar, seeing that his horsemen were in place, countercharged with immense ferocity, driving the Romans back towards their own fortifications. Hearing the given signal, Carriger also launched his assault, crashing straight into Theodorus's rear, hemming the Romans in and then encircling them. Many defenders were killed, but a few Roman units turned and burst through Huzafa's cavalry, managing to re-secure the crossing points.
Wow. I think the Romans probably would have been better off pursuing a more defensive strategy instead of, sullying out and fighting, but perhaps they couldn't afford to do that. The kings and generals said that, they didn't have the luxury of waiting out the siege, so maybe they had to take some offensive action, but it seems to have screwed them over a bit.
The remnants of the Roman army at Babylon retreated across the trench, pursued closely by Ammar's forces, who continued their attack up to the very walls of the fortress. Fighting continued in the space between the ditch and the citadel proper, until the gate was closed from inside.
Wow.
Those who got in were the lucky ones, as not a single Roman soldier remained alive on the field of battle.
Jeez.
The morale of Cyrus, who was not a military man by profession, and the Roman soldiery as a whole, was completely shaken by this stark defeat.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And to the prefect, it was clear that peace had to be concluded.
Yeah, I think even if you could hold out at this point, your morale would be seriously damaged by seeing most of your troops being slaughtered right in front of you. At that point, even if the walls of your city can protect you longer, you may just decide to make peace or cut a deal for the safety of your people and yourself.
To make matters even more dire, Ammar somehow got his hands on a few catapults and used them to launch deadly boulders, softening up the defenses. When this began happening, Cyrus departed Babylon with a small escort and took up residence on the mid-river island of Rauda, from which the fortress was being resupplied. Then the Coptic prefect dejectedly sent word to the Muslims that he wished to treat with them. Envoys were exchanged back and forth between the two sides, and Heraclius's viceroy attempted to offer Ammar a lavish bribe if the Muslims left Egypt, but the Arab commander responded by giving 3 options: conversion to Islam, payment of the jizya, or death.
Yeah, the same 3 options they always give. They're probably not going to take the bribe and leave. They're on a mission of conquest. We've seen what the forces of the Caliphate have done to the Sassanids and the Romans. They're taking over their territory, expanding their empire. They really have no need to take this bribe, even a big bribe, because it's really not what they're looking for.
Cyrus favored capitulating in some form, but his Egyptian colleagues wouldn't have any of it. So the stalemate continued outside the impenetrable fortress.
Interesting.
Since coming to terms with Cyrus was impossible, Ammar went into Babylon with a few companions in order to speak with Theodorus. However, when he was entering the fortress, a Roman soldier muttered to him scornfully, "You have entered, now see how you get out." Correctly believing orders had been given for him to be killed upon exiting the conference, Ammar tricked his way out of the fortress, convincing Theodorus that he was going to bring even more of his generals unwittingly into the trap.
Smart. Very smart.
These attempts at ending the siege failed, and the gridlock outside Babylon continued. But finally, in mid-December, the observant Zubeir noticed that since most of the fighting had taken place on Babylon's north side, the riverside Gate of Iron and its 2 guard towers were relatively undefended. Just like that, the Muslims had found a key to Theodorus' citadel.
Alright, I mean, we've had military gridlock, and now we've reached diplomatic gridlock, but the Muslim forces reckon they've found another way in. Maybe finally they can bring this siege to an end.
Swiftly putting his infiltration plan into action with Amr's blessing, Zubeir assembled a unit to conduct the operation. On the moonless, clear night of December 20th, 640, most of the Muslim army arrayed quietly outside the Gate of Iron, while Zubeir and his comrades climbed ladders up the wall. Then, when some of his men were gathered on top, a deafening Islamic battle cry was sounded, echoed by the entire army, causing shock and panic amongst defenders who had no idea what was happening.
Nice.
Amidst the chaos, Zubeir slew the gatehouse sentries and broke the chain which held.
It's honestly remarkable. We've seen such a long siege, which has reached, as we said, diplomatic and military gridlock, and then it ends so simply. They find a good position from which to scale the walls, get in there, open the gates, and I'm betting it's all over.
Held the gate closed, allowing Amr and the Muslim army to flood inside. While some of the more elite Roman formations made a brave last stand, most of their comrades routed towards the Nile. Once they reached the riverbank, the soldiers crossed to the safety of Rauda on pre-prepared boats, which ferried soldiers back and forth throughout the night. Among those who fled was Theodorus, who managed to escape Amr's grasp and run back to Alexandria. The next day, Cyrus sued for and obtained peace for the Copts on Muslim terms, agreeing to pay the jizya and submit the entire country to Islamic rule. The Romans in Egypt could either accept and remain, or reject and depart.
I mean, this isn't really what we're talking about, but look at the extent of the caliphate at this point. I mean, they've conquered a lot of territory since the series began, and a lot of pretty hard-fought territory. It's been an extremely impressive expansion so far, and I know we've got a long way to go, even now.
Unsurprisingly, when Heraclius received a letter from Cyrus seeking the imperial stamp of approval for his peace with Amr, the emperor was furious and categorically refused, responding with a message full of scorn and insults. To ensure that an active defense of Egypt continued despite the prefect's treachery, Heraclius had other messages ordering firm resistance delivered to all of his Roman generals in Egypt, who.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair enough. You don't want to give up any more of your territory, but, you know, if you can't send the resources to defend it, then what are you going to do? I mean, you can send the letters telling all your generals, don't give up, defend the city, etc., etc. But, you know, the empire is pretty understaffed, you could say, at this point. You know, their resources and manpower is stretched pretty thin. They really struggle to defend any of their territory, particularly the provinces and borderlands. So I understand why Heraclius is frustrated, and I understand why he'd send those letters out, but at the same time, he can't really do very much to back up his resolve. You know, perhaps he can send some supplies and some men. I guess we'll see if he does do that, but he really can't afford to commit too much to defending Egypt, not at this point.
Obeyed their sovereign without question. Cyrus, disavowed by the Romans, put himself and the Copts under Amr's command, promising the Muslims administrative and engineering assistance. Memphis was now secure, and the push towards Alexandria could begin. After the fall of Babylon to Rashidun forces in December 640, Amr ibn Alas kept his army stationed in the area for a while, dispatching word to Caliph Umar of his triumph and requesting permission to continue the conquest towards Alexandria. This pause also gave his army a much-needed rest. In Constantinople, the elderly and sickly Emperor Heraclius reacted to the latest Muslim victory by ferrying several thousand more imperial reinforcements to Egypt over the Mediterranean.
So Heraclius is sending some manpower to back up the defense of Egypt, but, look at how many men were present at Yarmouk, and that was still a defeat. Heraclius, he just can't afford to send nearly the number of men or supplies or resources that would be necessary to put up a solid defense, or at least I don't think he can. Maybe I'm wrong. Not to mention, he's getting on in age. Heraclius. Look, he lost a lot of territory to the Muslims, but he was always a great warrior. He fought back against the Persians, basically saved the Roman Empire, but he's getting a little bit older. There's only so much he can do in his old age, so, I don't think this is going to go super well for the Romans, but, I'm pretty unfamiliar with this side of history, so I guess we'll see what happens.
They had clear orders: protect Alexandria at all costs. Upon making landfall at the provincial capital, these reinforcements and the existing Alexandrian garrison, possibly under Theodorus's command, began working to strengthen the city fortifications and fanning out to defensible positions en route to the city.
Alexandria would be... you want to defend all of Roman provincial Egypt, of course, but Alexandria is really the one spot you desperately need to defend. It's by far the most important city in the region, and I don't know what Alexandria is up to when this is happening, but I do know that throughout ancient history, Roman history, Alexandria has been one of the most important cities of the empire. It's really been a cultural and economic center of the entire Mediterranean region, to be honest. So it's been very important historically. So, and it seems like, judging from this, it still is the most important city, at least in, the Egyptian province. So looks like that's the one place you'd want to defend.
Reports of these preparations made it south to Amr. At about the same time, a messenger arrived from Arabia with the Caliph's order to advance and seize Alexandria. So, leaving a small garrison to hold down Babylon and keep the Memphis region in check, Amr gave orders for his men to break camp. The 12,000-strong Muslim army headed northwards in February 641. Marching along the Nile Delta's western fringe, immediately adjacent to a familiar desert climate, the Muslims overcame light Roman resistance at Tanut and Qaum Sharik before turning northwest away from the river. After subsequently capturing Saltaeus, Amr then won a bloody victory at Kion, just 12 miles away from Alexandria, and chased the defeated Roman forces to the city's eastern approach. The march to the sea had taken just 22 days.
Wow. He's reached Alexandria pretty quickly. I guess we'll see how easy it is to conquer. I don't think it'll take... I don't think it'll be that quick to conquer it, but he's certainly reached it very fast.
Alexandria had been built by Alexander the Great and his Ptolemaic successors on a relatively narrow strip of land, bounded to the north by the Mediterranean Sea and in the south by Lake Mayotte. Since the main transportation routes ended east of the city, the only truly vulnerable approach was the northeastern one. The Muslims made camp outside weapon range and then deployed for battle, slowly advancing towards the recently reinforced Alexandrian walls. Unfortunately for Amr, such a careless preliminary move allowed the expert Roman artillerists to disrupt and scatter his units with volley after volley of massive catapult stones. This bombardment sent Amr and his warriors back to camp, dodging missiles all the way. Such attacks continued with intermissions, and in these intermissions, the Roman defenders would instead launch sorties out of the city and attack the Muslim army, aiming to throw it back and end the siege.
Yeah.
Despite the ferocity and competence of the men carrying them out, these attempts failed consistently and ended up being pushed back into the city. At some point during the first months of indecisive action, the defenders sorted out against a section of the front manned by the Arabian Mara tribe, and a fierce clash began. It seems to have concluded as an indecisive draw, but the Mara lost a man whose head was subsequently cut off and taken away by the Romans, much to the Arabs' fury. The next morning, the same thing happened. A Roman officer, probably made confident by the previous day's action, launched an attack on the Mara, but this time the outcome was very different. After being killed in the fighting, his head was taken by the Arab warriors and used as a bargaining chip to get their comrade's head back.
It seems fair enough. I mean, pretty brutal on each side, frankly, but now we're both taking heads. We're fighting using heads as bargaining chips. My goodness.
After a brief negotiation, both sides made an exchange and buried their kinsmen with honors.
I get it.
At the height of summer, around 2 months after Amr initially constructed his camp, the Sami tribal commander decided to shift it forwards for reasons which we are not aware of. However, as his forces were moving, the Roman defenders sensed an opportunity and mounted a daring cavalry attack, which nevertheless was easily repulsed. A reckless Muslim cavalry detachment set out in hot pursuit of the fleeing Romans and actually got inside the city.
Yeah, they've made it into the city. I mean, like I said, whenever there's a Roman versus Muslim cavalry exchange, I usually expect the Romans to lose. This is another example of that. We had that very rare victory in that skirmish earlier, but, you know, I really wouldn't bet too much on Roman cavalry power. But at this point, these cavalry units, these Muslim cavalry units, have literally followed them into the city. So they could wreak a lot of havoc from this position.
Just before the defenders could close the gates behind them. Heavily outnumbered, they fought a fierce skirmish at the so-called Church of Gold, in which some of them were killed and the rest were pushed out of Alexandria.
Yeah.
Heraclius, who maintained constant contact with Alexandria, was all too aware that the Muslims were gaining momentum. Worried that all of Egypt was about to be lost, he gathered a formidable army across what remained of the empire, together with equipment and supplies.
So he is pulling out all the stops. He is, the empire, which, as I mentioned, is strapped for resources and strapped for manpower. They really do not have enough to even cover the territory they have. He's drawing together what he can to defend Alexandria. So that really shows, the importance of this province. And also, like I said, he recognizes the Muslim momentum. He might be thinking, well, they take the Holy Lands, they take Egypt, where do they go next? We have to stop them here. So I'm kind of surprised that Heraclius is even able to do this much, but I'm curious to see, how much manpower he's able to actually bring together.
Just before this giant emperor-led relief armada was about to set sail, Heraclius died in Constantinople at the age of 66.
That is very unfortunate timing for the Romans. Heraclius lived a fairly long life, and while his record was kind of mixed, I'd say overall he did save the empire from Persian domination. He was quite the warrior, I think a man to be respected, but he just, really struggled to resist the Muslim expansion near the end of his career, though I'm not sure, like any emperor could have resisted the expansion of the caliphate. It was seemingly unstoppable. We've basically seen it, not quite, but almost bring down the Sassanid Empire. So, I kind of feel like you can't really blame him for not being able to resist that. I'm curious to see what effect his death has. I feel like that might really put might really restrict and put a damper on the Roman relief effort.
Leaving his eldest sons, Constantine III and Heraclius, as joint heirs.
Uh-oh.
This initiated a round of imperial politicking, which didn't
course.
allow the empire to react at the worst possible moment. As senior
This is one of the things. Jesus, I can't even speak. One of the things about a empire ruled in this manner. It's ruled by an emperor. It's dynastic, monarchical. There is a lot of this dynastic politicking. The emperor dies. Who's the successor? Do we have dual successors? Who's more powerful? Who's going to come out on top? Is someone else going to try and take over? It's very complicated. It's not a simple, handing over of power. The succession is very frequently a mess, and this really gives enemies and rivals a chance to take advantage of the chaos. So, this situation is probably going to prevent, at least for a while, the empire from sending aid to Egypt, which it desperately needs.
emperor, Constantine attempted to get a hold of the increasingly dire situation in Egypt. His untimely death only a short time later derailed those plans entirely.
Yeah.
If that wasn't bad enough, some Byzantine generals, including one Valentinus, took up arms in support of Constantine's son, Constans II, believing that Heraclius' mother, Martina, had poisoned Constantine. This dynastic struggle would not conclude until late 641, ensuring that no reinforcements would be sent to Alexandria.
Yeah, and this is why it's, this is one of the many reasons we moved on from a monarchical system of government. It's better to, say, have an election and say, okay, the new person takes over on this date and the old person leaves. And it's a lot more simple that way, because, if not, you get situations like this where Alexandria and Egypt desperately need aid, and that aid which was about to be sent is now going to be delayed for months, if not years, because of this dynastic struggle, infighting, violence between Romans. It's pretty unproductive.
Politicking also infected the soldiers defending the Egyptian capital, causing infighting and massive morale loss. When the siege had dragged into its 6th month with no sign of ending, Ammar received a letter from the Caliph chastising him for taking so long.
Ooh.
So,
that does seem pretty fair, considering Ammar really sold this conquest as, something easy. And Umar knew from the beginning that, he was kind of BSing. It wasn't going to be that easy, but now he's probably looking at Ammar like, okay, live up to your promise. You said you could take Egypt. Why don't you hurry up and take Egypt then?
after conferring with his generals, Ammar selected the experienced Ubadah bin as-Samit to lead an assault. In late October 641, the entire Muslim army assembled for midday prayer and then deployed for battle. Then, led by Ubadah, Ammar's forces finally captured Alexandria by storming a gate near the Church of Gold. Of Muslim achievements to this point, 20 years since Hijrah, the seizure of Alexandria ranked alongside events such as Yarmouk and Al-Qadisiyah in its importance.
Yarmouk and Al-Qadisiyah were two extremely impressive victories that crippled both the Roman and the Persian empires. This, while not as large scale, this is the capture of one of the most important cities in the region. So I would definitely rank it alongside those two victories. And once again, like the previous battle we saw, ended simply. We had a sort of extended siege, skirmishes back and forth, and then the Muslims, mustered their men, mustered their power, and pushed right in, broke through. Simple but effective, I guess.
The Caliphate acquired an invaluable naval base while diminishing Roman sea power, and conquered a land of immense riches and culture. Perhaps most importantly for the future, possession of Egypt allowed the Islamic armies to penetrate even further south and west into Africa.
Looking at the future, we will see the Caliphate extending all across North Africa. Access to Egypt, that's extremely important. Like they said, that's a really important point in the Mediterranean world. That'll be good for future naval power, and the Caliphate will be able to build that up to, compete with the Romans. They now have control over a lot of Egyptian history, culture, wealth. They have access to a lot more fertile land. I mean, it's a very rich province. That's why the Romans valued it so much. So this is a really big W for the Rashidun Caliphate.
The wealth, beauty, and luxury of Alexandria ensnared the Arabs and their general in equal measure. But Amr could not make his headquarters there without the Caliph's permission.
Yep.
So he sent an emissary back to Medina, asking Umar whether or not he could stay in the metropolis. Unfortunately,
Sending a letter back to Dad. Hey, can I stay the night at Alexandria? I really like it here.
for the conqueror of Egypt, one of the Rashidun ruler's many quirks was the absolute contempt and distrust in which he held large expanses of water, such as the Nile.
Really?
The single occasion on which Umar allowed one of his commanders, a governor of Damascus known as Muawiyah, to embark on a naval operation, the entire force had been destroyed. So Umar refused Amr's request, explaining, "I do not wish the Muslims to take up their abode where water intervenes between them and me in winter or summer."
Yeah, to be honest, I thought they were going to bring up Umar's dislike of luxury and wealth, and that's why he wouldn't want Amr to stay, but instead, dislike of large amounts of water. That's definitely a quirk. I guess everybody has their oddities, but that is quite strange.
Disappointed, Amr moved south and laid the foundations for his new city, the first capital of Islamic Egypt, Misr al-Fustat, the city of the tents, or Fustat for short. The country's new governor was occupied for the next few months attending to the administration of the Caliphate's newest territory. As 641 gave way to 642, Amr settled grievances among his warriors and the locals, revitalized previously abandoned pieces of infrastructure, including canals, and even dispatched food aid to famine-ridden Medina at Umar's request.
And that's one of the benefits of holding Egypt. Like I mentioned, they were at points thought of as the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Now you have control of that. If you're facing a famine elsewhere in the empire, hey, just gather up some of that grain from Egypt and send it back east. There you go. And that's some of the wealth of Egypt coming into play right there.
To extinguish any remaining embers of resistance against Muslim rule, Amr sent out 3 columns to the areas around Damietta, Heliopolis, and Fayum, while a 4th ensured that the remainder of Lower Egypt was obedient. All of them had an easy time, accomplishing their task without bloodshed by mid-642. With Egypt firmly in his grip, the adventurous Amr ibn Alas turned his focus towards a Christianized Nubian kingdom called Mercuria to the south. Mercuria.
Man, he's always looking outwards. Amr always has, another plan, somewhere else to go conquer. He's never satisfied with just governing wherever he's just claimed. He needs to go bigger. Though, that's a pretty good trait to have for such a young, expanding empire like the Caliphate. What we've seen so far is this sort of relentless expansion in every direction, basically.
Ruled by a king called Kalidurit from his great citadel at Dongola, was a rising and expansionist power in sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, its monarch had only recently annexed a former regional rival, Nobatia. A literate society with a vibrant culture of their own, the Nubians were renowned as hardy, ferocious warriors. In particular, their formidable reputation for horsemanship and archery was known around the Mediterranean world. At some point during the scorching African summer of 642, Amr sent his cousin Uqba bin Nafa and 20,000 horsemen into Nubia, where they quickly began suffering at the hands of the local inhabitants. Unable to resist the Muslims in a pitched battle, lethal but unarmored Mercurian archers, mounted and on foot, launched constant hit-and-run attacks which gradually sapped Uqba's strength before darting back unharmed into the wilderness.
Wow. I mean, the Muslim troops are kind of facing some of their own tactics. I mean, they're facing a different kind of enemy here, very different from the Romans or the Sassanids. Though, it's interesting because I really don't know much about the history in North Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa especially. But, the Muslims of the time, given their sort of capital is Medina, they're stationed around the Red Sea, I imagine they'd have a lot of links to, like, the east coast of Africa, that region. They'd have trade links, cultural links. They'd probably know sort of what was going on in that region. I certainly don't. But they probably have closer links to that region than, say, the Romans or the Persians would, given where the center of their empire is sort of located. We've seen so far the Caliphate mainly expanding, say, north and east. Finally, we're seeing them go, west into Egypt and sort of south or southwest.
As the Islamic army pushed deeper into Nubia and encountered guerrilla-style attacks in increasing numbers and ferocity, the hawk-eyed Makurian archers would frequently call out to the Arab invaders, "Where would you like me to put an arrow in you?" When one of the Muslim warriors skeptically pointed at an area of their body, our sources state that an arrow would indeed strike there, injuring or killing the man in question. When Uqba and his diminished forces finally neared the Makurian capital at Dongola, they found a smaller enemy army of around 10,000 waiting for them, forced into defending their central city by Uqba's movements. Eager to destroy the Nubians' fighting potential now that he had them all in one place, Amr's cousin began arraying his troops for battle. As the Muslim advance towards Kalidurat's line began, it was almost instantaneously hit by an utterly merciless barrage of Makurian arrows.
Damn, the Makurians really know what they're doing, particularly, these archers. And we've seen before, or at least we've talked about, how the Muslim troops were particularly vulnerable to Roman and Persian archers. I imagine this is the same thing here, because the Makurians seem to be doing a pretty good job. Though, maybe in a big pitched battle where they have to defend their capital, it might be different. I don't know. But they've been relying on these archers and sort of hit-and-run, guerrilla-style tactics that we've seen, some of the Muslims, and particularly the Arabs, used before.
That struck the attacking army with pinpoint accuracy. Uqba's assault was stalled in its tracks by the hail of missiles just as soon as it began, and his soldiers, 250 of whom had lost at least one eye in the battle, suffered terribly. Unable to close with the Nubian archers and swiftly losing men to grievous injury, Uqba withdrew his warriors from the field.
That's a pretty impressive ranged force. Not only do they do damage to the enemy or perhaps dissuade them, but, Uqba is trying to make a frontal assault, and they're literally being pushed back by this ranged force. Very impressive.
Forever after, Muslims would call the Nubians the Archers of the Eye because of their penchant for loosing arrows with deadly accuracy into the eyes of their enemies.
Wow. Quite the
Unwilling
nickname.
to continue such a difficult campaign in a land which promised them little gain from plunder or future land, the Muslims continued retreating all the way back to Fustat.
Yeah, with the resources the Caliphate had at its disposal, I'm sure they could have gathered enough troops to take over the region. But at a certain point, you have to ask yourself, is it worth it? And now that the Caliphate is a real empire, they're starting to ask themselves some of these questions. They've been expanding relentlessly, but now, they have an empire. They, have territories they have to look after. And when you're in that position, you have to ask yourself, do we need to conquer this territory? Is what we're going to gain really worth what we're going to lose? And in this case, it seems like no, it was not.
Although not exactly a decisive defeat, an army of the Caliphate had been defeated for one of the first times in history.
Wow.
After a month or two of recuperation, Amr assembled his armies from their bivouacs and personally led them west into the desert during September of 642. After a month of hard marching, the Muslims eventually arrived at a still Roman city known as Barca, which, having no arrangements for defense, quickly surrendered.
Yeah.
This was the first act of the decades-long Islamic conquest of a region which is now called the Maghreb. Amr had Uqba ride inland from the coast, where he successfully pacified the area of arid desert between Barca and Sawila with.
I mean, they're really taking a very large amount of territory. I mean, if you look at maps of the Caliphate a little down the road from this, you will notice the massive stretch of territory across North Africa. Now, I mean, I'm not too familiar with this territory, but I reckon a lot of it is rather depopulated. I mean, I think there's a lot of desert there, though of course we can see there's a lot of population centers along the coast, but a lot of this is probably very sparsely populated desert, but even so, that is a very large amount of territory to take over.
Without violence. The poor population quickly proved law-abiding and reliable in their payment of taxes, so Amr decreed that part of the revenues coming in from the entire Fezzan region would be spent to alleviate poverty there.
Oh, that's nice.
Then in spring 643, the Muslim army advanced on and blockaded the Roman garrisoned city of Tripoli. Amr set up his camp on an elevated section of terrain east of the city and waited, realizing that such a coastal settlement could be navally resupplied for an extended period of time.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the main advantages of a lot of these coastal cities that they're passing by and conquering in this region, is the naval dominance they could give the Arabs over the Mediterranean. I mean, they could be supplied navally, they could also be naval supply points. I mean, if you want to have a navy that's capable of, influencing a large area of the Mediterranean Sea, which I think is what the Caliphate wants in order to compete with the Romans, then you're going to need a lot of cities dotted across the coast of North Africa, and of course, I mean, ideally Southern Europe, but they're getting to it. They're moving westwards. So yeah, these could be very important sites in the future.
Lacking siege weapons, he also lacked the ability to reduce fortifications. After 2 months of relative inactivity, 8 of Amr's warriors galloped off west of the city for a hunting trip. When these hunters began making their way back around noon, the sheer heat of the day led them to ride back along the coast. All of a sudden, they came upon Tripoli's western boundary, where the city wall met the sea, and discovered that the section was only thinly protected.
Sometimes it just takes a little bit of luck. I mean, we've seen that the Muslims don't really possess a lot of siege warfare, so they kind of struggle with protracted sieges, but with the sieges we've seen so far, they've ended with pretty simple solutions compared to the long and complex events that led up to them. And in this situation, it just took a little bit of luck.
Display of bravery or foolishness, these 8 intrepid opportunists used Tripoli's vulnerable flank to infiltrate their way inside the city.
Oh wow, I thought they were going to go back to Amr, tell him there was a weakness, and they were all going to ride around, but these 8 fellas decided, you know what, we're just going to go for it.
Before the defenders even realized what was happening, the Muslim group reached the city center and began slaying enemies. Such unexpected violence triggered a bout of extreme panic within the city, both among the civilians and Tripoli's defending forces. In fact, a large number of the armed soldiers within the city believed that a large enemy contingent had somehow gotten inside.
I mean, I would too. I would not expect that it was just 8 guys that had snuck in. I mean, this is a pretty crazy thing to do. It takes a lot of cojones. It's, like they said, it's either bravery or it's insanity, but it seems like it's going to work, so, I mean, there you go.
And, because of this, took refuge aboard a number of anchored ships in the harbor. Amr caught wind of the pandemonium taking place inside the city, and so quickly set about exploiting the weakness. Arraying his warriors with haste, the Arab commander ordered a full-scale assault to scale Tripoli's enfeebled walls. In yet another action of which we have left no detail, the Muslims managed to get inside and joined their 8-strong vanguard.
Remarkable.
Unwilling to fight any further, the Roman defenders took whatever they could carry and departed aboard their ships.
I mean, this is an example of the idea that a crazy idea is only crazy until it works. If you would have said, how about 8 guys just sort of, march in and take over the city? You would have thought that is absolutely insane, but hey, if it ends up okay, then there you go, it's worked.
Leaving Tripoli to Amr's army. While most of the army stayed in the city for a while, the conqueror of Egypt sent a swift detachment of cavalry about 40 miles to the west, where the population of a town known as Sabratha were still carefree. They had heard rumors of fighting for neighboring cities, but it would be a while before the war reached them, if ever. The next morning, Sabratha's Roman guards opened the gates of their city, and its population began leading animals out to graze for the day. Unfortunately for them, it was at this moment that the Islamic cavalry unit struck completely by surprise, getting through the gates, killing the majority of the defending troops, and sacking the town. With that done, they returned to Tripoli. Having succeeded, Amr longed for more, and eagerly penned another letter to Caliph Umar containing both the good news of victory and a request to continue his conquest.
Alright, and we're going to end it there. I think we've seen plenty of Amr's conquests for today, and next time we'll see what on earth does this guy want? I mean, he's already conquered so much territory. What else does he want to conquer? Like I said, it seems like he always wants to expand, and it's been working out so far. I enjoyed this one. I hope you guys did. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.